This music's for my coolest nephew, Luke Towers, whose friends study collectivization in school hours. An overload of information makes it a devilish mystery. This recitation's for the examination of A-level history. Oh yeah. Beaten by his drunken father, who died when he was 11, his mother groomed him for the priesthood to guarantee his place in heaven. Stalin earned the nickname Koba in this Orthodox seminary after a Georgian bandit whose anti-Tsarist views were legendary. Then he joined the Bolsheviks, leaving the priesthood. Under Lenin, with aggression, objectively he stood for strength and for truth, his political ideals. So he took the name of Stalin, Russian for man of steel. Stalin became editor of the Bolshevik paper, Pravda or Truth, but was exiled a bit later. The communists had no documents or clear criteria. Any undesirables could be exiled to Siberia, to labor camps or gulags, forced to work malnourished. In 23 years, over 1 million prisoners perished. But not Stalin, that Spartan, as he concluded that he should return to Petrograd for the coup d'etat in 1917, as the communists needed him. And when Lenin died in 1924, who succeeded him? Well, it was Stalin, it was Stalin, it was Stalin all the time. And he had a 5-year plan which he just thought was so sublime. Part of his 5-year plan was to redivide their land, collectivization throughout the nation, an operation to feed the population with legislation and new regulations, a reconfiguration of private land holdings that they'd owned for generations. USSR pressed ahead with its industrialization, so bedniaks and kulaks surrendered their plantations, especially the kulaks who had livestock and 5 acres more land, according to Robert Conquest, than their neighbors. In 1928, there was a shortage of grain by 2 million tons, Stalin complained, and blamed the kulaks, as he claimed, "They are storing it and hoarding it. They should be ashamed." The Politburo, or Political Bureau of Communist leaders, demanded the immediate requisition or seizure of grain to sustain the population, which led to some peasants in desperation shifting to the cities with a mass migration of insubordination and insistence to evaluate and retaliate with violent resistance. Faced with the refusal to hand grain over, a central committee debated over the issue. It's true, they passed legislation for a nationwide program of collectivization, and A-level scholars have plenty of time to memorize the date, November 1929, when the committee implemented, of course, collectivization, kolkhoz and sovkhoz. This music's for my coolest nephew, Luke Towers, whose friends study collectivization in school hours. An overload of information makes it a devilish mystery. This recitation's for the examination of A-level history. Collectivization was the end of the world for some, and joining the collective was absurd and dumb and depressing and damaging for starters, so it gained little support from experienced farmers. Withholding grain and topping it up with collectivization, the surplus was intended to fund industrialization, but the Soviets seized the land from the kulaks. If they resisted, they were conscripted, killed, sent to gulags. Inexperienced urban peasants were then selected to replace the missing workforce in the agricultural sector, and this reverse migration encountered under Soviet rule was called the 25,000ers. 25,000 factory workers were sent to the Caucasus to reverse the negative trend and modernize agriculture in the Volga regions and restructure the land into parcels and replace peasant planters with the propaganda's promise of Fords and tractors. Do you think these factory workers knew how to grow grain, raise chickens, breed livestock, work until their bones pained? And did the promise of tractors materialize? No way! Did Stalin admit his own mistake? The biggest blow came when Stalin himself wrote Dizzy with Success, his article in Pravda, which was all propaganda. It was Stalin, it was Stalin, it was Stalin all the time, and his article was nonsensical propaganda, that means lies. He professed progress with zest and impressed, in March of 1930, halted the process of collectivization for a year or less, but as numbers kept dropping, he put pressure, nonetheless, on peasants to perform, suppressing their regrets, forbidding them to leave. Historians suggest Stalin's article blamed functionaries for his own excess, and that Dizzy with Success, his article in Pravda, was nothing less than political propaganda. For the Soviet government could manipulate what people believed and create false news, when in truth there were long queues for the bakery, the second serfdom for peasants, starvation and slavery. Unsurprisingly, grain declined rather than increased, and the tractors promised to the peasants were never released. When quotas were not met, Stalin forced collectivization by sending special regimes for the confiscation of any food they could find from the kulaks. Such treachery meant kulaks hid their food under cradles and in cemeteries. That's why there was a famine, but Stalin denied it, blaming the kulaks, claiming they were hiding it. All the food, all the grain. It's hard to understand the reason they would do this. They were lies, propaganda. And if you think this meant more food, re-examine, as collectivization and confiscation of grain led to famine. The Soviets' confiscation of food and grain affected 40 million people in the Ukraine, but the famine was most severe in Kazakhstan, where the semi-nomadic pastoralists with calloused hands had to manage the famine as best they can, and had to accept the ambitious agricultural plan of the Soviets. You know it was bigger in 1932, man. USSR meant Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan. This music's for my coolest nephew, Luke Towers, whose friends study collectivization in school hours. An overload of information makes it a devilish mystery. This recitation's for the examination of A-level history. So the 1932 famine convulsed the population and was christened Holodomor, hunger extermination. Between 1931 and 34, 5 million perished. A conservative opinion, 4 million of which, as I earlier explained, were from southwest Russia, now the Ukraine, and they weren't so much worried about anti-communism, but lawlessness and death and cannibalism. So as well as the forced relinquishing of property, cannibalism, genocide, shortages, poverty, a drop in production, forced migration, the collapse of the rural economy, starvation, Stalin's secret police were targeting especially the Ukrainian establishment and the intelligentsia for a campaign of repression and persecution of anyone involved after the February Revolution in the Ukrainian People's Republic. Tough luck. They were jailed, sent to gulags or executed, while their language and culture were persecuted and outlawed and abhorred by the Kremlin. The Holodomor was officially denied, which condemned them to genocide as they denied it for half a century. No wonder it looms large in Ukrainian memory, and no wonder there has been, for the last decade, a war between Russia and the Ukraine, which is why Russia today has resorted to the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II. It was Stalin, time, his campaign against the Ukraine, Holodomor, was genocide. This music's for my coolest nephew, Luke Towers, whose friends study collectivization in school hours. The overload of information makes it a devilish mystery. The recitations for the examination of A-level history. A-level history. In 1934, Stalin murdered Kirov, his political rival, causing the fear of another purge which would emerge from 36 to 38. So it wasn't only Ukraine that suffered his dictatorship, there was major shit with party leadership, the old Bolsheviks, those who opposed him or were sympathetic to Trotsky were imprisoned or executed. They would not keep their heads shot dead. Purges expanded to the Red Army. Like a tsunami, a lack of vision, as he had decimated his own military. The intelligentsia, kulaks, those involved in conspiracy, the vulgar Germans, the Poles, were tortured under interrogation, imprisoned and executed during mass operations by the NKVD under Nikolai Yeshov. Then Stalin turned on him and cut his head off. Or rather he was shot, as is fitting with the time. I only said beheading, as it fit with the rhyme. Up to 1.2 million died in the Great Purge or Terror, an allusion to the French Revolution's reign of terror, accused of crimes like sabotage, anti-Soviet agitation, just a fraction of the victims of collectivization. But in 1939, I must confess, of the 2,000 delegates in the party congress who backed Kirov, over 1,000 had been executed, and with nationwide exiles and persecutions, there was no opposition in the Soviet Union, which led to a weird engineered union. Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. One was Soviet, the other fascist. Go figure. Stalin invaded Finland, Hitler took control and occupied France. They divided Poland, but it was all a ruse for his own convenience. Once secure in the West, Hitler broke his agreement. In 1931, Hitler was such a megalomaniac. He invaded Russia. Purged of senior officers, the Red Army was decimated, and about to flee, Stalin about turned and estimated if he took control of the army and no regard for human life, he could throw millions of ill-equipped men into the fight. And as the Germans kept advancing, Stalin had a memorable victory at Stalingrad. But over 1 million Soviets died in the battle, and thousands of civilians who were slaughtered like cattle. It was Stalin who beat Nazi Germany. He turned the tide, over 1 million died, many more in the infirmary. Between forced collectivization and the gulags, the Great Purge or Terror, persecution of kulaks, of Germans, of Poles, the deportations that Stalin had, the Holodomor, the Soviet famine, the Kazakh famine, Stalingrad. Some scholars claim he took the lives of 20 million, a dictator like Pol Pot or Hitler, in my opinion, Mussolini, Idi Amin, Mao Zedong, Pinochet or Franco, Kim Il-sung. And as the facts you learned in class over time could fade, I hope the facts you learned in this rap will provide good grades. Cause this music's for my coolest nephew, Luke Towers, whose friendly study collectivization in school hours. An overload of information makes it a devilish mystery. This recitation's for the examination of A-level history.